love, pain. What are these words doing together? Love that takes us to the farthest limit of what it means to be human, to be real, to be spiritual. And by spiritual, I don't mean, sitting in a Buddha position or looking at any kind of figurine of some spiritual figure or reading any kind of text, whatever that text might be. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about the connection of the spirit. And just for the record, I really don't believe that there's any universal spirit with which one can get in contact. I'm not a follower of Carl Jung or any of those people who talk about a collective unconscious or anything else along those lines, but there is nevertheless something. As Sigmund Freud said, there is no such thing as a collective unconscious, but it's collective anyway. But I'm getting off on a tangent, you might say. Love, pain. Pain hurts. Love swells us up to the fullest, and then pain comes along as a way of doing that. Just look at literature. Look at operas. Look, for heaven's sake, at the people you know around you, and then look at your own life. Look at what that's been. Look at the pain that you have experienced. A very wise person shared something recently that I thought was extremely interesting, and that was, pain will leave once it has taught you what you need to know. That would be marvelous. As long as what pain has taught you is not that you're not the person that you hoped that you would be, your life is limited in ways that you always thought it would be, that's not what pain is supposed to teach you. But let's tell a story. It's not really a story because it's about a friend. How can I say that? It's more like an acquaintance who sometimes shares things with me, and so I've constructed, if you will, a kind of narrative about his life, but I confess that I must have filled in some things because sometimes it's like an onrush of things that he needs to unload on me, that he wants my response to. But how do you respond to a narrative like this? It's very hard. So there he was, from what I know about him. He had been living in San Francisco, and he'd studied, I don't know where, he'd studied somewhere up there, and he was a fairly early person in terms of Silicon Valley, and he knew a bunch of stuff about algorithms and the sorts of things that they're very much interested in Silicon Valley, as well as vast databases and having a huge structure of networks online that were not supposed to crash, but would nevertheless generate data for the people who really run our lives, the advertisers, the governments, those people. They're really in charge, and they need data. They need to know every bleeping thing about you and me, and just to, you can be very calm about this. They do. No use trying to protect it. So, my acquaintance, having spent some time on the fringes of the Silicon Valley business, actually working more in San Francisco, decided that he would go and accept a job in the Northern Virginia part of that business. And they do a whole bunch of stuff back in Northern Virginia. You think of, used to be that you'd think of Virginia in terms of segregation, and you think in terms of Robert E. Lee, and a whole bunch of stuff you think about in terms of Virginia. But nowadays, Virginia is this tech hub, and it's spreading out from Northern Virginia into other parts of the states. It's a tech hub. So my friend is working there, and he lives in Washington, D.C., which strangely enough is where his parents had brought him up, and he really didn't like it. People think that it's a great cultural city and this kind of thing, and from his experience, it really isn't. It really wasn't. He never connected with it. Every time he had an opportunity to go to New York, which was kind of like his dream city, he would take it. He wouldn't exactly hitchhike, but any opportunity, friends were going up there, whatever, he would go to New York. He absolutely loved it. He wasn't sure why. He was a very interesting character in the things that he was focused on really in his life, except for databases and all those other things. He loved to do a certain kind of installation art, which involved a number of things. It involved projection, it involved sound. It was, as they'd say, immersive. It was immersive installation art, for which he provided some of the film elements, some of the video elements, some of the visual art elements, and it was really quite intense as an experience. One left his installations with the feeling that one had really traveled somewhere. Not necessarily outside of the self. It was like going inside of the self and being renewed. He was quite good at that. In addition to that, he was a songwriter. He was pretty serious about being a songwriter, and his songs were interesting, a little bit droll, but they always touched something inside. And they were in a number of different genres. One of his favorite artists was Sheryl Crow, and what's not to like about Sheryl Crow? So he wrote a number of songs, and he sent them to Sheryl Crow's management, and Sheryl Crow liked them. She recorded a couple of them, but what's even more interesting is that she got some artists that she was promoting herself early in their careers to record them too. So he was kind of not exactly in a role, but between his work, which was not satisfying, but it was work. And it didn't pay him as much as he would have liked, but it was work. So there he was. He'd bought a house kind of out beyond the Northern Virginia Tech Hub, a little bit farther out into the exurbs. What do they call them? He'd been living in D.C., but then he'd moved to this house. And he was, what do they say, between 6s and 7s, between 8s and 9s. It was a weird place to be. And being the tech person that he was extremely skeptical of social media. But one day he was on Facebook and he saw a friend request from a woman. She was quite attractive, and it said, "You look rad." Who says you look rad anymore? But, he'd put a picture of himself on Facebook that some women found kind of alluring, which was not an easy thing for this guy to look alluring. But anyway, they developed this thing back and forth, and she had dual U.S.-UK citizenship. And that's kind of bizarre. She was born in the U.S., but her parents were mixed nationalities, and kind of like the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. Like Boris Johnson, she had dual U.S.-UK citizenship. And she was in London working an office job that she didn't much like. And as far as, education, her education had stopped at a fairly early point, so she'd really hit a glass ceiling in any number of ways. The British are more sexist, if you can use that word still, but I think it's a good word, even than we are here in this country today. There are few opportunities, and particularly fewer opportunities for women without higher education, so there she was. So they develop a correspondence. I should say that she was actually living with another guy who was some kind of foreigner. Back in the days of the EU, pre-Brexit, there were a lot of people from weird places in Europe, or so they seemed sometimes to him, who were living in, he was a Spaniard, nothing wrong about Spain or weird about Spain, but they were living together. And she wasn't happy, and she expressed her unhappiness with the Spaniards to my friend/acquaintance. And before too long, my friend slash acquaintance got a Facebook message that she had left her Spaniard, broken up with him, was living alone someplace up in Shoreditch. Shoreditch is very near the city of London, which is used to be the financial hub of the Western world, now perhaps no longer is so much. But Shoreditch is not anything like the city of London. It's kind of a long tube ride to anywhere that you might possibly want to go, but there it is. And she had a flat in Shoreditch, and there they were, these two. And boy, my friend thought that she was coming on to her, and he was kind of reciprocating in that. They were back and forth all the time. They spent tons and tons of time on Skype. They had long conversations about their previous lives, and I don't know too much about those conversations except that they occurred. They happened. So my friend, my acquaintance, visited her in London, and she visited him in the D.C. area, and it didn't take too much longer before they were kind of on a roll. And before any real thought had gone into the matter, they were in this online Skype relationship that was, they had a lot in common. She was interested in the sort of art projects that he did, and she was interested in the songwriting things that he did. She was kind of a writer, had written some lyrics. There was some sense that some collaboration might take place. So, there was, as I talked about in a previous video, there was a premise for a relationship between my friend slash acquaintance and this woman. So it just built and built and built. One day he got on a plane, and if you live in the D.C. area, going from Dallas to Heathrow is kind of like nothing. It's not like going from Los Angeles to Heathrow. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump, but not even the skip. It's just a hop across the old Atlantic. So he proposed to her, but that was a foregone conclusion. This was going to happen. He proposed to her, and the mechanism was in motion. They were intimate. I don't know too much about that. My friend's acquaintance is not very forthcoming about these things, and who should be? One is not required. And by the way, when I spoke with him, even when he was essentially downloading things to me, I never encouraged him. I seldom even responded, because I'm not a professional counselor. I have a background in research psychology. I know a lot about psychology in terms of particularly psychoanalysis, on through the whole history of those people, object relations, Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, the great genius of psychoanalysis in the era after World War II, but many, many others, Sandor Ferenczi. I've spoken about these people in my other videos, but I'm not someone who's going to psychoanalyze, a friend or an acquaintance. So finally, in the midst of all this, he's proposed to her. She's accepted his proposal. It was a beautiful moment. It seemed like this glorious romance, and yet he would go over and visit her in Shoreditch, and he would buy her gifts and bring her wonderful things every night. She would, from this rather flavorless, colorless office job that she was doing. It was a government job, and in a certain way she didn't even understand what it was. It was a very strange kind of deal, and she had an aspiration was to attend the London School of Economics and receive whatever the British equivalent is of an MBA. My friend may have explained it, and if he did, it's way out of my head right now. It's not of any interest to me. But that was her goal and her aspiration, figuring that once she had her British equivalent of an MBA, she could have a satisfying career either in the city of London, in the financial area, or an academic career, or many other things, or a government job that really meant something for the British government. So, my friend sells my friend/acquaintance. I fell out of touch with him in a little bit, but I found out that he'd sold his residence in that Virginia exurb, way out beyond, Langley, where the CIA lives, and those places in Fairfax County. What's the next county beyond that? I don't know that area very well. But he'd sold it, and it was at a loss because it happened to be at one of those dips in the real estate market, and he had moved to London, and he moved in with her in her little flat in Shoreditch. And, well, they needed a bigger place, they needed a better place, he needed to find a job in the UK, which as an American was not that easy, by the way. But a whole sort of stuff was going on, a bunch of stuff was going on, and they were, in the meanwhile, looking for a better place to live than Shoreditch. She'd become focused on kind of an interesting little area, rather as if it were between Kensington, which is way too Tony and pricey for just about anyone, and Hammersmith. Fun little area in a certain way, famous for, as she explained to my friend/acquaintance, a pub known as the Dove. And she rapturously, which was not exactly her style, said that the person who had taken her there to the Dove, gender not specified, had explained to her that Graham Greene and Ernest Hemingway had hung out there. That was reason enough to take an interest in this particular area of London. They saw a number of flats there that were quite wonderful. He met a number of her friends in London, and they seemed to get along well. Interesting group of people. Also a similar shared interest to the ones that he had and she had. I perhaps forgot to mention that she was also an artist very much interested in the types of things that he did. The sort of installation, multimedia, but that word sounds so silly. It's a sort of 1960s kind of word, not that I was around in the 1960s. Far from it. So they had been out looking for flats in that area that she was interested in, and he rather liked it too. And having a grand old time, hadn't found anything that they had really liked or really ready to sign on the dotted line for. But then she went back home, back to her place, the place that he was living at that particular moment, and she spent huge amounts of time online and all the listings that you could possibly find anywhere for flats. Again, concentrating on that area. And the whole impetus of their activity was they were looking for a place, and they were going to move there, and they were going to continue on their lives from there and do the whole ball of wax. Is that the expression? Do the whole enchilada, if they had enchiladas in London. She was spending a lot of time in another part of London, and I think it's up kind of North London, the kind of Amy Winehouse kind of a part of London, if I can say that. I didn't know that area that well, although if I'd known Amy Winehouse, I would have been very happy to be up there because she was a genius. So then she'd, spend much of the night up with friends in that part of London, and he was back in Shoreditch because she said, well, these are not friends she would necessarily like or, relate to. She was helping to babysit a newly born child. There are a number of different reasons that it wasn't appropriate for him to go. So one night she came back late to their flat in Shoreditch, or her flat that he was living in at the time. There was something a little bit strange about her affect. She was telling stories about odd things that had happened on the tube, but they were really rather strange. They went to bed without any kind of physical contact. That's what my friend tells me. And the next morning, he does what he made her coffee, And during that time, he'd gone out and bought her a bunch of stuff. Sometimes it's difficult to find a good croissant in Shoreditch, but somehow he went somewhere else in the city. I forget where. And he got a nice bag of croissant and that kind of British jam, these kind of stuff that they like. And they're sitting across each other at her dining room table, and she says the immortal words, "We have to talk." Or maybe you don't. In the course of relationships, there's nothing more thunderous, no matter in what tone it may be said, than, "We have to talk." It's not going to be what you want to hear, but you know that you're going to have to listen to it anyway. And you know in a certain way that you'll be a different person after that conversation has taken place. You will be a different person. Pinot Grigio de Venezia. Sorry, I took a sip and you can't. Sorry about that. So she says, "We have to talk," and he says, "Well, is it about?" And there are a number of little issues, things that she wanted him to do that came up between them. He was thinking that she was finally fed up with his recalcitrance or his stubbornness or his delay and dealing with a couple of things. And she said, "We have to talk. This isn't working. This isn't working." So, this isn't working. Those words. We have to talk. This isn't working. We have to talk. This isn't working. Pain words. Pain feelings. Pain. So it takes him a few days to sort of get organized. And he's sitting in her kitchen kind of doing things on his computer. He's sleeping in a kind of little sofa on the other part of her very small flat. It was like it had a bedroom, but it was almost like what we'd call a studio here. It was little more than a studio. And he was just making those arrangements. He had no idea where to go. He'd sold his house. He'd sold his house at a loss. He didn't know a heck of a lot of money from what he told me. A friend of his had offered him to stay in a house he owned in Maine. And he said to himself, well, what is a better place to chill out than Maine? Trying to find that sense of humor. Sometimes it doesn't come easily. So he finally made it over to Maine. He'd put all of his belongings in storage actually it was a good thing. They didn't end up getting shipped to London, but they were in storage. He was paying for the storage. He had no idea what the rest of his life would be. He didn't have much cash. He was paying his friend rent money for the place in Maine. Meanwhile, his woman friend in London, it's not exactly that she was holding out hopes of anything going on from there, but she was, he of course had this dream. People have dreams, and his dream was that she would change her mind. The dream that they will change their mind. Love, pain, rejection, and that's basically a word we have to face up to. And the dream that the other person will change their mind, will change their mind. But of course the correspondence and the interaction was about things like money and little bits of assistance that she needed, trying to maneuver herself to get admitted to an education program in London or somewhere else in the UK, which would eventually get her into the London School of Economics, which was her dream, and why not? People have dreams. Just like he had a dream of being with her, she had a dream of that, a more practical dream. But here's a part of the story that he was a little bit reticent to express to me. And I'm just going to say the words and not necessarily extrapolate from those words. As some of you know, I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. And I sit there and I basically write what I see. My rule for writing is watch the movie. Rule number 2, when characters show up, they're there for a reason, just like in real life. And when a character shows up, I know all about them. And when I'm watching a scene, I know all about it. So I write as a novelist. But in the case of this, this isn't a novel. This is this acquaintance of mine kind of sharing things with me. And what he said was that on that morning in Shoreditch, in London, when he had made coffee and brought out the croissant and whatever kind of British jams and jellies that he'd picked up, and they were good ones from what he told me, she said to him, "You will never be acceptable to any woman." Or I think it was slightly different. He said, "No woman will ever find you acceptable." And the way my friend said this to me, it was as if this woman he was in love with was speaking a truth. And I'm not going to extrapolate, I'm not going to play novelist, I'm not going to imagine or fantasize as to what she meant. She could have meant a whole variety of things, a broad variety of things. My friend, from the best of my knowledge, was, and presumably still is, a kind and generous and compassionate person who, from what he tells me, has always loved women from the earliest age. In a way, what do I mean by love women? I mean, he's been attracted to beautiful women, beautiful girls. And he had this, I call it a skill, he really enjoyed it. And it was a mutual enjoyment. He really enjoyed chatting up girls and then women because he enjoyed it and they appreciated the interest that he took in them. He was dealing with them in a way, interacting with them in a way that neither their girlfriends, nor other guys, nor their parents, nor their teachers did. It was kind of like there was an enjoyment in the interaction, but also a great curiosity on his part, a great responsiveness, and a great ability and a great desire and a great passion, if I can call it that, to really interact with what the girl, later woman, had to say. He was telling me about back in Virginia, they'd been somehow this guy ended up in some kind of a special program. I have no idea whether it was for the dummies or for the smart kids, but there was a group of maybe 25 kids who'd been brought together from all of the schools in the county where he was brought up. And there was a really cute little blonde. No one's very big at that age. And he was telling me how much they were all about to go on a school bus for this little group to go someplace bizarre, like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I think that's what it was, for some educational reason. And she just was enjoying talking to him so much, and vice versa. Years later, he found out that she'd become, this beautiful blonde girl had become a pediatrician and was living in Texas. Some people do that. So my friend is up there living in Maine, sort of, assisting his love in London with various things and relating to her. When she had issues, she would call him or text him or email him, even the things that seem rather absurd. I've lost the key to my flat. Here I am in Bangor, Maine, and you're there in Shoreditch in London, England, and I'm supposed to deal with the fact that you have lost the key to your flat. What is he supposed to do? But he guides her through it. Well, could it be with this person? Or could you have left it with that person? Or does this person, a friend of yours, have a duplicate set of keys to your flat and all that? So he sort of guided her through that from Bangor, Maine. It was odd. But enough of this. I lost touch with him for a while. They had the ultimate falling out. He became aware that she was deeply involved with a man, which he could scarcely blame her for that deep involvement. So there she was, and he said, and then she proposed to him. Proposed to him. They were engaged at that point. St. Paul's Cathedral in London is where they got engaged. Nice place, nice building, old. But at any rate, she proposed to him that he might help her financially and in various ways going forward in time as she finished her set of degrees or schooling that would be necessary to get her British equivalent of an MBA, whatever that is, from the London School of Economics. And he said, this would all be great if we were living together. And she said, no way. And that was pretty much the end of that. So this guy, my acquaintance, wandered back down to the Washington, D.C. area where he no longer had a house. He'd sold it. No longer had a job. And it's amazing how quickly you can fall out of that entire tech, internet thing. One day you're in it, and the next minute, it's not like your old news. You're kind of out. And there's no kind of loyalty. There's no kind of... It's like other businesses, a little bit like the motion picture industry, of which I am the world's greatest authority. Although I have many friends in that business, don't get me wrong. So he's back in D.C. and he gets himself a little apartment near DuPont Circle. Not the worst part of town to be in, necessarily. And they used to have really good movie theater there. I don't think they still do. That's what he told me. He used to go to see movies there. The Circle Theater in DuPont Circle, a kind of repertory cinema. But whatever, I don't know these things. So he's back in D.C. and he's hanging out with a woman whom he'd known in D.C. He spent a lot of time with her, and he always was a little bit infatuated with her. And she wasn't particularly fond of this idea of him selling everything, giving away everything to move to London, and she didn't exactly try to talk him out of it, but she sort of did. In the meanwhile, my acquaintance's infatuation for this woman, and just for the record, this was a really, really beautiful woman. Back in high school, my acquaintance told me that, well, he was great at chatting up women, but at the end of the day, he was really overweight. He had some kind of glandular problem. It wasn't just a matter of exercise or the usual sort of things, or dieting, or diet pills. Whatever was available, he tried everything, but nothing really worked. So he would, chat up girls, and they would really enjoy his company. But as far as going out on a date, remember dates? We talked about dates and dating last time. A curious topic. So he was back in D.C., hanging out with this very beautiful, in his eyes. I never met her. I saw pictures. But he was becoming more and more infatuated with her, and I think he had really taken a fall in his self-esteem when this woman in London had told him that he would not be acceptable to any woman, that no woman would find him acceptable, including her. one of his dreams in life, he had dreams involving his art and his music, but one of his dreams was that he would have this beautiful woman, and beauty was a necessary but not sufficient criterion. Women had to be beautiful. Would be part of his life, and that he would also nurture her. Is that the right word? He was also encourage and support and value and treasure and cherish her aspirations. I think there's a good theory that creative people should be with one another, because people who aren't creative do not understand creative people, and vice versa. I'm ready to be proved wrong, but I've known over the course of time creative couples who, they don't have to be creative in the same way. Writing and music and visual art and sculpture, dance, all the wonderful ways in which people can be creative. Publishing is creative. You know, these are the couples that work the best. And if you have like a strictly business person in the couple, or someone who is much more into just the social life for what it is, and trips and travel and vacations and getting together with friends and watching television. Sport that I'm not particularly attracted to, never have been. Watching TV. While drinking Pinot Grigio di Venezia. Beautiful city, Venice. Love to be there. But, so here's my friend, and then, you know, he's very much infatuated with this beautiful woman, and then another, and in a strange kind of thing happens. He's very inspired in his songwriting. He's very inspired in his putting together new ideas and concepts for these installation art projects. Installation projects would sometimes involve drama. Sometimes they involved a certain degree of almost athletics. They involved lighting. They were immersive, but the word immersive doesn't even cover it all. It was like, and it wasn't for the idea of taking a person outside of themselves. I think I said this before. It was, the whole idea was to let them explore inside themselves, to stimulate them to do this. Not the way that drugs purportedly are supposed to do. Note all of those qualifications. But he was having this extraordinarily inspired creative person, and then he met another woman. And this other woman, if anything, was doing the same thing to him. She was, you know, of course she was very beautiful, a necessary criterion, but she was also amazingly creative in ways of her own. And he just was overjoyed in the ways that he could be encouraging to her. A fantastic situation, but from the standpoint of what you want to call love, there was nothing. There were words of love, but there was no physicality. There was no intimacy. There was no interest. There was no zaza-zoom on the part of the other woman. It's the infatuation woman number one. One of her favorite words was zaza-zoom. If there's no zaza-zoom, there ain't nothing. So that was where my friend ended up, and my acquaintance ended up, and I kind of lost track with him. But despite his emotional reticence, despite talking to me, whom in a certain way he scarcely knew, perhaps he spoke to me because I was not evaluative, the way that a lot of people are. You know, perhaps because I did not know any of the other dramatis personae in the drama, didn't know them. So I was not going to in any way interact with them or play some kind of third or fourth or fifth wheel or try to influence anyone on his behalf or otherwise. I was simply removed. I was living in North Encino, if you want to call this place something. I guess you have to call it North Encino. interesting and kind of sad. I think we have 5 Mercedes-Benz dealerships, 6 day spas, all the things that a number of wine shops, none as good as I would like. North Encino. You know, as Garrison Keillor used to say, where all the IQs, all the kids are above average. But, you know, what is average? Or is it the median? One loses track of these things. So there he is, and he was... The question I would ask is, did his pain ever go away? Did he learn his lesson and then, as this item I saw posted, this very wise item I saw posted, did the pain take a hike, leaving him having learned a lesson? I don't know. In a certain way, I don't want to know. These are stories, the things that happen to people. I believe that he felt that he, you know, perhaps having been denied going out on a date or going to proms or dances or the other things that, you know, young people do in high school. He was denied that because he would call these girls up that he chatted up and had these wonderful interactions with and said, "Hey, you want to go to the dance?" Or I think he had kind of a deep, seductive voice. "Hey, you want to go to the dance?" He tried any number of things. And they always said no. So, you know, that was his teenage life. But enough of him. It's just one wonders. He felt that for the sake of his ego, he wanted to be with a one. Oh, he had a long set of criteria, but they were not bad ones. Beauty, creativity, intelligence, spirituality, as he would have defined it. We talked about this earlier. A certain spark, a certain energy, openness to new experience, which correlates, as I discussed in one of my other episodes, with creativity. The people who are open to new experience, and this has been proved by 70 years of personality psychology. You can take my word for it. People who are open to new experiences are the creative people. Sensitivity, receptivity. A woman who is willing really to share. Not that she cannot or should not have her own inner self, but he wanted to be with a woman who felt pain, who when she felt pain, when she felt discomfort about anything, when she felt in an odd situation, or when he wanted to be there and to make her feel that whenever she wanted to share, whenever she wanted to interact with someone who really, really cared about her, that she would have no reluctance, no reticence. Nothing would hold her back from sharing those things with him. Not that he was going to lay down the law and say, you know, this is what you should do in this situation. I'm the guy and I know best. Father knows best. Daddy knows best. Here I am, you know, your boyfriend or your mate or your husband, and I'm the guy. I'm the ultimate. I laid down the law. I know what's best for you. Men have a way of saying that. And if they don't say it in so many words, they've got a lot of different ways of saying it. Don't they? Don't they? As we were talking about in the previous episode, you know, men really like to lay down the law, then they shut women out. They don't want to hear anymore. They're not interested. They're not interested. What are they interested in? A mother for their children. That's a big one. You know, men want to carry on the family name, and heck, you know, I did. Never did it, but I've got some good stuff going on in my family, going back hundreds of years, and significant people who did significant things that I'm rather proud of, and I would have liked to have had a child, son or daughter, but it never happened. The woman said she wanted to, then she changed her mind. Changing one's mind is a good thing. So let's talk about one more thing, which is not necessarily irrelevant to what we've spoken of so far in today's short take, which deserves another sip of Pinot Grigio. De Venezia. So here's a word in bold, and that word is trust. Trust. I am often confounded. I am often flabbergasted by the fact that women ever trust men at all. It just doesn't make any sense that a woman would ever trust a man. Think about it. We spoke last time in our episode on dating about the man who has a monthly budget for taking women out, and his idea of taking women out or going on dates is simply to, hopefully, to get laid, or, I'm sorry, to get blown, you know, to get blown away. But I mean, that's what men do, and every time a woman agrees to go on a date with a man, she's like, the man's definition of a date is very, very largely to have a sexual encounter, if not at the end of this date, at the end of maybe one more date after that, and if 2 dates doesn't do it, he's pretty much going to close off that little adventure and move on, which men do. So that's men, and when a woman goes out with a man or accepts an invitation to a man, and women accept invitations to men in ways that from men in ways that I find astounding. You know, why would a woman travel with a man, or whatever, unless she really trusts him? Trust. Out here in California, where I'm stuck for the moment, waiting to find a way to go, move to New York, or Munich, or Rome. Love Rome. Milan, I love Milan. I used to go there every year in my business, go to Milan. Lovely, lovely places. UK don't work for me. Unlike my friend, my friend had this fantasy, of living in London. That's one of the attractive things about this woman he became engaged to. Boy, he wanted to live in London. Well, different strokes for different folks, but women trust men in ways that are ridiculous. But as I was saying, out here in California, we have this thing called an advance health care directive. In other states, it's called other things. I think it's called a living will in a lot of places. But what are you doing? You fill out this thing. In the state of California, you can file this advanced health care directive with the Secretary of State of California, and you carry around a little card. And the little card says, you, whatever your name happens to be, have filled out an advanced health care directive and have filed it with the Secretary of the State in the state of California, and if you are found incapacitated somewhere in a serious accident, you can't speak, you can't communicate, you're in the hospital, you're on life support, and the Secretary of State of the state of California will fax or email your advanced health care directive to the health care facility, the hospital, or wherever, and that advanced health care directive lists the people whom you trust to make health care decisions for you in the event that you are not able to do that yourself. That's big-time trust. That's big-time trust. big time. And in mine, what you can do is you can lay out the law. You can say, in mine, I've said, you know what? I want to be kept on life support as long as I can, because if I've got any money, why not spend it on keeping me alive? I'd rather be alive than dead. Although I have a certain amount of faith in reincarnation, but I want to hedge my bets. I'd rather stick around for a while. So I'd rather be alive, and if I'm going to die, cryogenics. That's the thing for me. Turn me into a pit sickle somewhere and thaw me out. Thaw me out, baby. Be a good song. Thaw me out, baby, in the future. A pit sickle. Something to be lovingly licked back to life by a beautiful woman. But why have only one beautiful woman? Why not have 3 or 4? How delightful that would be to return to the living, to return to consciousness, to be resurrected by beautiful women, which is what we all seek as men, to be resurrected from our dull, dry status. As men who, after all, do not have wombs, cannot have children ourselves, require the other gender to achieve those things. So for the man to honor and worship women is a wonderful thing, but by the same token, for a man to truly enjoy the physicality of being with a woman, and several women perhaps at the same time, is much to be desired, particularly at that moment of resurrection, I should say, from one's cryogenic, frozen, pit sickle state. Interesting film about that called Abre los Ojos by Almodovar. I always mess his name up. Anyway, look for it. Abre los Ojos, Open Your Eyes, which is a wonderful film starring Penelope Cruz, and she's quite attractive in that film. But in this Advanced Healthcare Directive, there are 2 things that you designate. One is an agent to make those decisions for you within the constraints, within the definitions of what you have written there. That's the first thing that you designate. And you can designate alternates. If person number 1 is not available or decides at the last minute they don't want to do it, or any other reason, there's several others behind that person whom you trust. Maybe a little bit less than person number 1, or maybe not. That's the first thing. And the second thing you do is you select an agent for the conservancy of the body. And that means that if you are adjudged, if you are, for example, in one case in a coma, or in another case, if you are in a permanent state where it is determined by medical authorities that you are just going to be in that state for a long time, incapable of making decisions for yourself, perhaps utterly nonverbal, one of those things. So those are 2 different categories. You can designate different people for different things. So you're faced with the issue. I was faced with the issue of trust. I know who I trust. I trust people I love. Love and trust should be intertwined, should be related. Now, does that mean that, if you're in love with a person, and if you're in a relationship with them, or if you're married to them, or that kind of stuff, that you are going to allow them to make every decision for you, and that all the things that they want to do are the right things for you, and that you're going to, trust them to do business for you, or trust them to involve you with the right kind of spiritual practices, even. They can guide you, but you don't necessarily want to trust them for something. If your partner, your mate, your husband, your wife is suddenly involved with, I don't know, a cult. Cults do exist. I don't know. Maybe you don't want that. You're not going to trust that person to say, come along to the cult meeting and we're all going to get naked and have sex and swear our souls to the great devil god Gamba. The devil god in the old 50s movie, The Devil's Hand. I'm taking absurd examples. But it's trust. We are confronted with issues of trusting other people even if we do not wish to be. We can't choose not to trust. We are forced to trust. Every time I get in a motor vehicle with someone, I am forced to trust the other driver. Every time I get in a motor vehicle, I'm forced to trust myself in a certain way. It's strange. It's not to make one paranoid or antsy or untrustful or skeptical about other people. It's just an experience that we go through all the time. But as I was stating a few moments ago, I think women are faced with this in a way that often men, heterosexual men, never are. Seldom are. If I spend time with a woman, well, there are things that women can do that, as I was pointing out before, it can lead me into that may not be the best thing for me. And if I'm, so my trust can, to what extent should my trust be absolute? I used to know a woman, and I'm not really in touch with her. What are these expressions? Month of Sundays, a decade of Thursdays, these expressions, a long, long time. Very, very brilliant woman. I'm an artist in my own way, and her art would be like mine taken to the ultimate degree of brilliance. Fantastic artist. She was living in Chicago, where I have family roots going back. Is it possible to say going back to the 19th century? Yea, verily, the German part of my family. Prominent and doing very interesting things in Chicago in the 19th century. Can you believe that? A long time ago. Out of many of our frame of reference, the 19th century. But she was an artist. She was taking classes at the, what do they call it, Art Institute of Chicago? Chicago Art Institute? I don't know. It has art institutes many, many places. But I really liked what she did. Did I say a moment ago that it's similar to the things that I do, only raised to this incredibly high level? And she told me once that when she was quite young, and she implied that she was kind of inexperienced, but I don't want to speculate on that. So she had been spending time with, I don't think dating would have been a part of her vocabulary either, but she was spending time with a guy from Uzbekistan. Perfectly, it's a place, Uzbekistan. And if I remember correctly, I think he had something to do with import-export. There are things in Chicago that they export and things that from Uzbekistan that they export in to the United States. And what these things were, I was not precisely sure. It wasn't jewelry. It was kind of the raw materials for making jewelry and sculpture and things along those lines. I may have this totally wrong. So they're spending time together, and they're intimate. They're lovers, whether or not they are in love. I don't know. I never asked her. It wasn't necessarily pertinent. So one night, he and she are spending the evening at her apartment, and she knew that he had invited some of his friends to join them. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to sit around and talk and maybe, what do? Drink wine? I guess they drink wine in Uzbekistan. I think they do. I think when push comes to shove, people drink wine everywhere, and the world's a better place for it. More Pinot Grigio. So his friends start showing up, and after a little while of just sitting around in a somewhat undefined situation, a couple of them start loosening their belts and unbuttoning their shirts or blouses. Maybe one of her lover's friends had even taken off his shirt, whatever. And maybe one of the women had done that too, but they weren't like, it wasn't as if they were engaging in any kind of physical activity with each other. They were kind of, it was kind of as if this guy from Uzbekistan had suggested that his friends come over because this was a house, an apartment occupied by a woman who was hot, and they might have a good time involving her. And at a certain point, she said, well, I mean, this was becoming extremely uncomfortable for her, and at a certain time, it was her apartment, just to emphasize that again. She said, well, you are welcome to hang out here, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm going out. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to go for a walk. That's what I'm going to do. Trust. Trust. So this is, as Paul McCartney once said, the world in which we live in. A world of love, a world of pain, and a world of trust. I'm going to wrap up this short take on love, pain, and trust here with a reminder that this series is configured to explore issues of love, sensuality, relationships, all of those things. From two standpoints. The first standpoint is, the first springboard, you might say, is Western, and I should be more specific, European philosophy, ancient and modern, and psychoanalysis, by which I mean European and British psychoanalysis, as opposed to what goes under the name in the United States. Well, this has been an episode of stories, little bits of things I have learned or things I have heard, spun out into narratives of a sort with a certain amount of commentary on my part. I have drawn inferences, if not to say conclusions, certainly not to say conclusions, from these stories, from these episodes. I've tried to make sense of them, but my intent is really to lay them at your feet with the hope that you would contemplate them, try to understand, and look in your own life. Look in your own life at love. And that sounds almost like a cliche. Love is not a cliche, by the way. Despite all the love songs and all those other things, all the poetry, all the great professions of love, and I've certainly made some on my part. Love is not to be belittled. And learning the way that others love and feel about love and express love and what love means to other people, both people you love yourself and other people in general, is really the greatest education, if you don't mind my saying that one can have in life. It's not that there is a a great force out there called love that we're all supposed to tap into. I kind of don't believe in that kind of thinking. I don't relate to it in a certain way. Love is too personal. As I mentioned at the beginning, love isn't like a thing of the collective unconscious. Love isn't some kind of great force that exists all over the place that we're supposed to tap into. That just doesn't work to me because that puts love somewhere else. Love isn't somewhere else. Love is in our hearts. Love is somewhere in everyone's hearts. Love is in your cat's or dog's heart, by the way, in case you haven't noticed. This is love. In pain, and trust. Next time, perhaps we'll go and return to our traditional subject matter. Think about things, or don't. You're free. It's your choice. Immediately after I had wrapped up this short topics on my podcast series, I received an email from the acquaintance whose story I related in rather vague outline, bullet point manner earlier in the podcast, and it seemed incumbent upon me to append something along the lines of a coda, something along the lines of an addendum, something along the lines of an epilogue. I'll tell you basically what it was. This is a party, an individual, a male individual, who was, I would say, not even peripheral to my life. He was so far on the fringe, it's hard even to place how we came in contact to begin with. It had something, I think, to do with computers or networking or something along those lines, or possibly he had seen some of my art somewhere on social media. You know, I had seen some of his, so there was some vague communication, and we certainly met a number of times when he was here where I am in beautiful, scintillating North Encino, where all of the podcasts are above average, if not better. As many emails from acquaintances from whom one does not hear on a regular basis, this particular email had a number of references to individuals and events and situations, a job situation and other things happening to him back in D.C., where he'd moved after his brief stint in London, and then his kind of year of chilling out in Bangor, Maine. So he's back in D.C., and he's telling me various things, and I'm sort of halfway tempted to, but not that tempted, not even halfway, maybe a tenth of the way, to search my emails and see what the last email had told me about his life. But then I kind of gave up. Something came into my mind about his fiancée. I believe she had actually gotten into the London School of Economics. Another element that just popped up into my mind is the fact that she had actually been, I love this word cheating. What does that mean? Well, if you're engaged to someone and someone comes to another continent, as it were, to marry you and live with you, I guess that constitutes cheating and not some kind of a tolerated little side adventure between two people who have not formalized anything at all. So anyway, she'd been already involved for quite some time with a guy who was, we talked about Amy Winehouse and North London and all of those places up there, and apparently he had some kind of job at a bar or at a nightclub. Did he run the place? Was he a part owner? Was he a bouncer too? I have no idea. Maybe my friend had said that somewhere or emailed me that somewhere, but I have no idea. So that was kind of the deal of him having been ejected by this woman with whom he was madly in love. And our theme here was love and pain, trying to understand and explicate the elements of his pain and how he did or did not deal with those elements. His hurt, his transition from being merely this body in pain. Interesting title of a book I've read by someone named Scary, The Body in Pain. And he was the whole being in pain. We don't believe in this mind-body dualism a la Mr. Descartes that a lot of people do. The mind and the body are the same thing, and he was in pain all over. When your mind's in pain, when your heart's in pain, when your soul's in pain, when whatever inside you feels and loves is in pain, it's a generalized pain of the entire being. It's beer this time, folks. It's a nightcap on top of my Pinot Grigio della Venezia. I was kind of vaguely interested in trying to reconstruct things about this peripheral acquaintance's life. He did not mention, actually, in this particular email, either the woman to whom he'd been engaged or the women for whom he'd developed infatuations, which were apparently quite strong infatuations back in Washington, but they were not infatuations that he knew going into them that they were one-sided. And maybe he wore his heart on his sleeve once or twice, but it became readily apparent that these women whom he was actually in love with. I think my friend, I understand his way of saying things, and it's pretty clear that he was in love with both of these women, and their presence in his life, although, what's the right word I'm looking for? Unfulfilled? What is the word for, their words for relationships, non-relationships like this? Unrequited? Non-reciprocal, unreturned, not reciprocated, non-mutual, not shared, one-sided, that sort of thing. But anyway, he had a very creative period, but something in his heart was not what it should be. I get the feeling. Something in his heart was still in pain. And I guess he was still trying to figure out the lesson from all of this that would enable him to get out of that pain. So at the end of this email, right before he typed his initials, which is how he usually signs everything, rather than either his first or last name, what he closed off with was, "Women do not see me as a man." Women do not see me as a man. And rather than extrapolating on that or creating some kind of novelistic explanation or psychologism or speculation or building up a story about that or imagining anything about his interactions with either of these women or with his fiancée or former fiancée or with other women in his life, going all the way back to the beautiful blonde girl he was chatting up as he was going on a field trip in the 7th grade. Which of these women did not see him as a man? Curious thing. This led me to think back to some of our kind of fundamental overview episodes where we talked about cliches and we talked about roles. The thing about cliches, let me stop for a second. The thing about cliches is they have an amazing way of being true, uncomfortably true, painfully true, awkwardly true, disarmingly true, infuriatingly true. But one thing about this particular cliche is that many men marry, even get into long-term relationships because they want to have a replacement for mommy. And the idea that this is the wife or the girlfriend is a replacement for mommy is reinforced by the fact that she actually becomes a mommy herself. This is just a little aside on this whole notion of the man who marries mommy. who then becomes the mommy to his children. We've been talking about this, and just as a side note to that, of course, that is the ultimate prohibition. That's what King Oedipus did. By marrying the mother of his children, he's both marrying his own mother, one might say, and marrying this person who occupies the role of a mother in another way. It's really, really strange when you think about it. I mean, all marriage, all relationships that are sexual at all are basically Oedipal, and in that sense go back to the very origins of the dissolution of the male psyche into neurosis or even into psychosis. Think about it. Curious. And this is an anecdote, if you will, which is something that is part of my memory, not of anything communicated to me by my peripheral, distant acquaintance, who is peripheral to me as a yet undiscovered dwarf planet, seemingly eons beyond the farthest planet yet known in our solar system. It's circling around. It's hard to see when seldom, if ever. Nowadays we never know anything about it. It hasn't been discovered yet. But when it is discovered, it will have tales to tell. So, my friend, I was in college and I met him as an undergraduate, and what did he talk about doing? He had a really kind of interesting academic career planned for himself and all that sort of thing, and we were members of some sort of group that was studying some kind of very esoteric, even if you will, academic subject, and ultimately, eventually, just like his father before him, he enrolled in medical school. That did not deter him from being in touch with me. He was a young fellow, a chap who really liked women. I don't necessarily think that he treated them badly, except to say that the woman he eventually married, he had his first intimacy with by staying overnight at my apartment at the time, thus cheating, if you will, on a woman who'd been his regular girlfriend for quite some time, as long as I'd known him. But he seemed to be someone who generally liked women, as opposed to the men we were talking about in another portion of this episode who didn't like women at all. As a medical student, who liked women, he would date dental hygienists, because part of the medical school was a dental school, and there they trained dental hygienists who were young women. And as a favor to him, I would book appointments with these trainee student dental hygienists because they needed to clean any number of teeth, a certain number of teeth every week to fulfill their requirement. And what he was doing for them was to bring in people, friends, individuals, to have their teeth cleaned. And boy, I had the cleanest set of teeth short of a spanking new set of dentures. They were incredible, those teeth I had back in those days. But in taking classes, it's interesting what the doctors who are professors and medical students will tell their all-male classes, to the extent, I think this was a few years ago, and there were still some all-male classes in medical school made up primarily of white guys. That's how it was. And it is that way in a number of places around the country, I assure you of that. So one of his classes, the professor closed the door behind him and said, if you're interested in having a sexual dalliance, the best candidates for that are women just after they've delivered a child, because their husbands just aren't interested. So these women are extremely receptive, per this instructor, to someone who is nice and sweet and someone who examines their body in a singularly medical fashion, but that, per this teacher, could easily segue into some type of actual sex. Yes, this is what my friend learned in medical school. As far as I know, he did not ever practice this. So again, that's my little addition to that particular subject matter. Many men marry, even get into long-term relationships because they want to have a replacement for mommy. He marries mommy, he gets mommy, kind of a deal. And she's the housekeeper, and she is the caretaker of the children and the organizer to a greater or lesser degree of what goes on. And the home front, well, he's off, daddy's off, the man is off doing what the man does, either in sort of anonymous, amorphous office type of situation, ambiguous and ubiquitous office, or he's doing other jobs that men do of greater or lesser stature. But still, he is the daddy, and he fantasizes that he is in some way the master of the house, but he has a lot of doubts about that. And one of the things that is, he does not even notice himself, but his wife, his girlfriend, his partner, the female he lives with, is no longer that sexually attractive to him, and every once in a while he performs a sex act involving her. He attempts to dictate what that sex act will consist of. He customarily will need an oral sex encounter on her part before he can perform, and depending on the situation, that particular moment, typically, and in terms of the general scenario, she is not excited or interested in doing this. One must be in a certain frame of mind and spirit and heart, and to have achieved a level of sensuality, rather, ecstatic or not, to want to do such a thing, if one is a woman. But she does it, and then there's, penetration, which does not last very long, typically, and that's that. And this does not in any way reconfirm his masculinity to him at all. It's just an activity. It's an event. The philosopher Alain Badiou talks about events as something that can redefine and give new definitions to things and open up new truths from which we gain a certain degree of enlightenment and can live more creatively in a larger way subsequent to such events. But these sexual encounters for him are not events whatsoever. That's the cliche, and of course then he's also acting in a certain role. He's acting the role of the male partner in a relationship with less and less love, less and less eroticism, less and less sensuality, and less raison d'etre, the great reason of being. There's no reason for it. It's just people walking through life, kind of like the other person I mentioned in the very first part of this podcast. And from the woman's point of view, she's kind of flipped that over, and in no way is the husband, the mate, the male mate, the partner, exciting to her, stimulating to her in a physical way. Very often, by that point in the situation, he is really withdrawn emotionally, to the point that everything becomes about logistics. We talked about that sort of thing before. There's no, whatever premise there was of togetherness, of mutuality, certainly of growth and expansion and discovery and creation, all of that has been swept away by the mundane. The mundane has a way of sweeping away our dreams. It's a great cleaning agent for that kind of purpose. And those are the roles and the cliches that people often fall into, and my peripheral acquaintance, although not exactly in that situation, or in that situation at all, had reached this conclusion, the conclusion, that women did not see him as a man. They saw him as something else. They saw whatever qualities in him that were applicable to their goals and ambitions and things that they were interested in. Or, he was and is presumably a very gracious, I think I mentioned this before, very generous sort of person who's really good, from what little I understand, and I get the impression that he's fairly good at anticipating women's needs, not only their needs but their desires. But all of that didn't add up to anything. There was no zazazoom. I brought up that word before. And it's one of his girlfriends used, or one of the women he was infatuated with used that word, zazazoom. But there was nothing there, so that was that. That was the terminus of any forward trajectory in those situations. But he's, sitting back at his, presumably, I think this email was typed on an actual computer, not on a phone, in whatever state of mind he was in. Knowing him, I would have assumed that maybe he'd had his own glass or two of Pinot Grigio della Venezia, or beer, as I'm doing now. And he'd had this revelatory nuance, this burst of insight, and having had that burst of insight, one wonders if it had left him. People talk a lot about self-esteem, and it's not a bad thing to talk about. When you emerge from a context, and even if it has been a painful context, and when a man, for example, or a woman, emerges from such a context in a certain framework, from a certain perspective, the man or the woman can basically feel better about themselves. I've learned something. I ain't going to do this anymore. Well, just for the record, yeah, you're going to do it. You're going to do it again. That's just how things are. The Wiederholungswahn, the repetition compulsion. We talked about that in the very first episode of Explore Ecstatic Sensuality. So, on the one hand, I don't think, and this is pure speculation, that my friend was like in the doldrums. He'd gone through that. His fiancée had said, no woman will find you acceptable, which I'm still, I don't know. Something brings to my mind that famous and oft-discussed, oft-debated thing that Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst and also philosopher, said there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. And there must have been a couple of thousand pages at a bare minimum of writings by Alain Badiou, who I mentioned before, and many, Elizabeth Rounescu, who was Jacques Lacan's biographer, Jacques-Alain Miller, who was his son-in-law, and in effect the default editor of his seminars. He was famous for the seminars that he held at the Sorbonne and otherwise in Paris, thanks to the intervention of the French philosopher, French Marxist philosopher, Louis Althusser. But the whole notion of whether there is actually ever a sexual relationship between a man and a woman, it's interesting. Jacques Lacan first proposed his famous formula, Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, in 1970, and took it up again in his seminar of 1972 to 1973. This formula is usually translated into English as there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. However, it might be better rendered, quote, there is no relation between the sexes, unquote. thus emphasizing that it is not primarily the act of sexual intercourse that Lacan is referring to, but rather the question of the relation between the masculine sexual position and the feminine sexual position. In his view, there is no direct, unmediated relation between the male and female sexual positions because the other, capital O, of language stands between them as a third party. It is language, it is once again words, that stand between men and women in this sense, given that we are, I'm going to use an extreme word, victims of language and the way that language frames our interactions with other people and our thinking inside our own minds. According to Jacques Lacan, love is no more than an illusion designed to make up for the absence of harmonious relations between the sexes, whether presented in mythical terms, as in Plato's Symposium, or in psychoanalytic terms, as in Balant's concept of genital love. The sexual drives are not directed toward a whole person, but towards part objects. This harkens back to object relations theory, which we discussed in one of our basic introductory videos, although I must say that Lacan had a rather different overall approach to object relations than did people like Melanie Klein. But we'll continue. There is therefore no such thing as a sexual relationship between two subjects, only between a subject, a person, and a partial object. For the man, the object A, objet petit a, the object of desire which we seek in the other, occupies the place of the missing partner, which produces the matheme of fantasy. In other words, the woman does not exist for the man as a real subject, but only as a fantasy object, the cause of his desire. As something rooted in the real, sex is opposed to meaning, and, quote, sex in opposing itself to sense is also by definition opposed to relation, to communication. You women out there, imagine how many instances you've had, even considering with your husband or permanent mate, where that husband or mate has really gone to bed with a fantasy of someone. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if he is a radical leftist, and who would he choose? Melania Trump. Imagine her famous sets of lesbian photographs prior to her marriage. Those might be interesting fantasies for a man to have. More Jacques Lacan, woman, for the best of reasons, can on no account be castrated. Jacques Lacan, Seminar 19, ou pire, or worse. So much of psychology, when it occasionally it takes a little side trip and discusses women for 5 minutes, but so much of the time is talking about men, is talking about the phallus, the penis, the Oedipal complex. They tried to come up with something called the Electra complex to relate to women's love of their fathers, but Freud didn't think much of that. It's a nifty opera by Richard Strauss, neither here nor there. But here we have a situation where the woman does not have that constant anxiety that men are supposed to have of being castrated, does not have that constant need to express things phallically through penetration, but also through competition strictly on the basis of sexual prowess or sexual personality, does not have the impulse, the impetus to constantly being dominant in that particular type of way. And it's that sort of male dominance, the emphasis on the phallus, on the penis, is the sort of thing that in relationships between men and women has as its ultimate goal, in many, many cases, sexual violence, sexual abuse, and rape. That's the origin, the man's anxiety that he's going to be castrated, therefore he has to dangle the thing out there and let it get hard and show it. Let it be the knife or the sword and inflict its damage. The whole of the analytic experience, which merely gives form to what is for each individual at the very root of his experience, shows us that not to want to desire and to desire are the same thing. Jacques Lacan, Seminar 11. Fascinating fellow. Desire. Objet petit a, jouissance. Desire is a major theme for Lacan. Another famous statement that he made was, never give up on your desire. I don't know anyone else is going to say that to you necessarily, except some sort of one of these guys who stands before an auditorium full of people and charges you a couple $100 for a seminar on how to succeed in business, or things along those lines. What's his name? Robbins, something like that? Will say that to you. But he doesn't have any psychological, psychoanalytic groundwork for saying that. Never give up. Never give up on your desire. Never give up. Back to Lacan just for a moment. Quote, the value of the other partner, which I began by designating respectively as man and as woman, is unapproachable through language precisely because language functions from the start by standing in for sexual jouissance. Again from Seminar 19, pire or worse. Wait a minute. A simple translation of jouissance can actually be orgasm, but for Lacan it means so much more. In a certain way, it's the unattainable object of desire. It is full and complete desire. Lacan said somewhere that if sexuality and sexual activity, if our sexuality as a whole were really in partnership with jouissance and really had understood that this form of mutual jouissance between man and woman was in fact an achievable, realizable goal. He also said some things that are quite disturbing. Woman does not exist. What does that exactly mean? Woman does not exist. And perhaps the most disturbing thing that is often quoted runs something along the lines of, love is giving something to someone that you don't have and which the other person does not want. You're giving something to someone, and you don't have that something, and the other person doesn't want it. One can wake up in the middle of the night with thoughts like that in one's head. That's the interesting thing about the whole deal, isn't it? Really, truly is. That everything would be wonderful, but he was, like many psychoanalysts, in a certain way, he was something of a pessimist. But this podcast, Explore Ecstatic Sensuality, is not about pessimism. Quite the contrary. Unlike our friend who'd reached that moment my distant acquaintance, you'd reach that moment of concluding an email to me, his only very transitory, infrequent correspondent, women never see me as a man. I have the sneaking suspicion, or sneaky supplication, that I'm not going to be hearing that much from my peripheral acquaintance from now on. I don't know why. It's as if he's reached this moment, and has gotten it off his chest to someone who is not in any kind of daily or regular or frequent at all interaction with him. He's gotten it off his chest, as they'd say, to coin a phrase, not to unburden himself. It's just by putting this into words. By putting it into words, he felt this was a way of dealing with it. And one wonders how often in his mental Wiederholungswahn, his mental repetition, the same sentence, subject, verb, predicate, the same syntax will repeat itself. Women do not see me as a man. Curious thing. Perhaps he does not see himself as a man, but I rather doubt it. Strange thing. And what is a man to do? A man looks around for a woman who really sees him as a man. But often if the man goes about on that exploration, on that expedition, he often comes up in situations just like the situation that my peripheral acquaintance has done, either with his infatuations or with his girlfriend slash fiancée. That's where it all ends up. He wants to be seen as a man and ends up seen as something else. Another member of the dramatis personae, another member of the cast. So this has been a little footnote, a little appendage, a little epilogue, a little coda, almost a kind of eulogy, for love and pain. Before we close out today's episode of this podcast series, Explore Ecstatic Sensuality, I thought that I would quickly give you a preview of something that's coming up. Let's return for a second to a theme that we introduced in our very first episode. If we allowed all of the external inputs from all of our senses, as well as the sensory signals generated by our nerves and organs internally, to get through to consciousness, we would be overloaded and burn out in a matter of minutes. Burnout would be too much for us. Each species, including human beings, therefore of necessity develops an algorithm to filter out most inputs, and the criterion for that algorithm is survival. Subtle aesthetic sensory pleasures, both internal and external, are thus excluded from our awareness and repressed into our unconscious mind, where they build up and lead to aggression either against ourselves or against others. To have fully ecstatic sensuality, we must slowly train that sensorial algorithm to let more inputs in, while at the same time training our minds to appreciate these expanded sensations and to allow them to trigger ever more conscious, aware, and vibrant forms of sensuality. The joy of love and sex with a partner happens when both female and male do this, as in some ways the algorithms are gender specific. The male algorithm for filtering out sensory inputs, external and internal, is different from the female. Ecstatic sensuality is a form of shared meditation in which the boundaries between erotic sensuality and spiritual sensuality and sensuality vis-a-vis life in the universe slowly fall away, and we become as, in effect, gods, masters of a destiny in which true fulfillment and enlightenment through pleasure will be achieved. Coming up, we are going to tie this into the notion of sensitivity and receptivity. And we will demonstrate how expanded ecstatic sensuality can at the same time bring expanded, elevated sensitivity between two people on every level: communication, emotion, understanding, all the things that we wish to have with our sexual partner, if I may say, a romantic partner, and also with others we are close to. The type of receptivity is a word I used a moment ago, which is very important, and sensitivity, a word I cannot repeat often enough, to appreciate the true subtlety, the true nuance of how human interaction can take place. So that's coming up, just to give you a sneak preview. So we move on and perhaps return to our general topics, as I mentioned before during the first part of this presentation, which is viewing life and sensuality and relationships from the standpoint and jumping off point of European and occasionally British, you can't lump them together anymore, not that you ever could, psychoanalysis, as opposed to ego psychology and other such things as is practiced by people like Karen Horney and Freud's own daughter Anna Freud, etc., and also from the standpoint of European philosophy, going back to the very beginning all the way up to where we are today, assuming that we are indeed somewhere. Here's my recommendation of a love and relationship coach and a psychotherapist. Her name is Anita DiFrancesco. Her website is www.tantrawisdom.com. She's also on her Tantra Wisdom Facebook business page and her Love and Relationship Coach Facebook page. She is not only a love and relationship counselor and psychotherapist, she is a 2-time national award-winning journalist and the author of 2 excellent books: Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, which deals with matters such as the ones we discuss here in this podcast: mindfulness, sexuality, relationships, and so forth, and The Donna Gentili Story, a spellbinding true crime thriller about the brutal murder of her first cousin and of her attempts to identify the killer. Both of these books, Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, and The Donna Gentili Story, are available on Amazon, or check her website.